Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, number 92 by the way, we will explicate a story that has had the reputation of an alcoholic uncle at a family picnic. The story is narrated in Genesis 38. You will find it in no list of lectionary readings. It is never used for Sunday school instruction, and it is never the chosen text for a sermon. No hymn writer has used it for inspiration. The story features a bizarre, even repulsive, cultural practice and a sex scene that is too graphically depicted for polite company. No wonder the episode is obscure. Were we to take a vote, we might vote it right out of the canon. To make matter worse, if that is possible, the pericope interrupts one of the most beloved stories in all the Bible, the story of Joseph that begins in Genesis 37. Just when the drama of that story is building, and we are sitting on the edge of our seats wanting to know what will become of Joseph after being sold by his angry brothers to a caravan on the way to Egypt, we encounter this distracting episode featuring Judah and Tamar. Why did someone insert this strange account here, of all places? What gives? Let's take a look at the details to see if we can figure out this odd juxtaposition. Genesis 38 begins innocuously enough when we are told that Judah left the company of his brothers. That's in verse 1. What do we know about Judah at this point? He was the fourth-born son of Jacob and Leah. Leah, of course, was Rachel's sister. That's in Genesis 29, verse 35. And at the beginning of the episode involving Joseph, Judah had talked his brothers into sparing Joseph's life and instead convinced them to sell him to Midianite traders. That's in verses 27 and 28 of chapter 37. That is why Joseph ended up in Egypt. That is all we know about Judah so far. It is curious, however, that Joseph had left his brothers involuntarily, while Judah had left his brothers because he wanted to do so. At this point, all we can do is notice this interesting contrast between two brothers. Also, just as Joseph was spirited away by the Midianite traders to Egyptian foreigners, Judah befriended a man named Hira, an Adulamite, and thus also a foreigner. The contrast, though, is that Joseph had been enslaved by foreigners while Judah had met a foreigner as a free man. Now, as he was rubbing elbows with Canaanites, apparently an Adulamite is part of the Canaanite population, he took notice of a Canaanite woman whose father's name was Shua. Right off the bat, Judah made this woman his wife. That's in verse 2. That in itself was a little out of character for this family. Recall what Abraham did to make certain that his son Isaac married within the family, and what Isaac eventually did to ensure that his son Jacob married within the family too. Not to mention the consternation Esau, Jacob's brother, had caused the family in marrying two Hittite wives, that is, two non-members of the family. Those stories are found in chapter 24 of Genesis, chapter 27, verse 46, through chapter 28, verse 5. None of these family dynamics seem to concern Judah in the least. He married the first Canaanite woman he saw. Immediately, he started his family. He fathered 3 sons. But the narrator gives us a little insight into the dynamics of Judah's family by offering telltale hints. At first, the birth of these 3 boys appears to be completely ordinary and unremarkable, but a closer look reveals patterns which are hardly flattering to Judah. Here's what happened. Judah's wife bore the first son, whom Judah gave the name E-R. That's in verse 3 of chapter 38. The second son that was born was named Onan. This time, Judah's wife did the naming. That's in verse 4. This is not unprecedented. Sometimes wives or mothers do the honor of naming children. When the third son is born, Judah's wife once again names the child Shelah. That's in verse 5. But this time we are provided with a little more detail. When the wife names the third child, we are informed that he was in Keziv when she bore him. That's in verse 5. Often, translators have been confused by this reference. They typically translate that she was in Keziv at the time of birth. But the Hebrew has he, not she. Translators go by the Greek text in this case, which can be either a masculine or a feminine reference, because you cannot tell that from the verb in Greek. The Hebrew, though, makes perfect sense, namely that he was in Keziv at the time of birth. Here is why. First, the Hebrew is straightforward, so there is no reason to cast around for solutions. Second, the letters used for the name of the place, Keziv, are the same letters used to spell a word that means liar or deception. In other words, Judah was, so to speak, in Liarsville when the third child was born. Where I live, in the Pacific Northwest, we would say that he was at Deception Pass when she bore him. It would be ridiculous to conclude that the narrator wanted us to believe that the mother was in the same place as the child when the birth took place. Babies are always with their mothers at the time of birth. There are no exceptions to this rule. So, here is the revealing pattern in these details. Judah names the first son. His wife names the second son. The wife names the third son, and Judah is not even in town at the time of birth. Instead, he is visiting Liarsville. This will not be the last time in the episode when we realize that Judah has trouble with the truth. This naming pattern is our first clue. Time flies, and just like that, Judah's children are grown. So, Judah procures a wife for his firstborn son, The name of Er's wife was Tamar. That's in verse 6. Unfortunately, did something terribly wrong, and the Lord saw to it that this son died. Was not around long enough to have any lines in this unfolding drama. At this point, we are introduced to a cultural practice that is as foreign to most of us as it is disgusting. The cultural practice assumed as the background of this story is sometimes called levirate marriage. Here is what that entails. When one brother dies before he has fathered any children, that puts his future in jeopardy. This is because he has no heirs and therefore no claim on the future. This puts an obligation on a surviving brother. That brother, the next eldest brother, is required to get his sister-in-law pregnant so that his deceased brother will have something of a future. In this case, died and left Tamar, his widow, childless. Onan, brother, was now obliged to make his sister-in-law pregnant. Even though any children that came from this union would belong biologically to Onan, they would actually form part of future. Because of this, Onan rebelled against participating in what he saw as cultural nonsense. He didn't like this practice. Had he held his ground, we as readers might have had a little respect for Onan. But this was no principled protest. He was not against this practice to the extent that he left Tamar alone. He did have sex with her, grammatically, perhaps on successive occasions. But he made certain that she did not get pregnant. To do this, he was guilty of coitus interruptus. This is somehow sounding better in Latin. In the graphic language of the biblical story, though, he spilled the semen on the ground. So, he could have his sexual pleasure, but not allow the woman with whom he was sleeping to become pregnant. It turns out that the Lord was not amused by Onan's behavior, so the Lord made him suffer the same fate as his deceased brother. Judah's first two sons are now gone, and his daughter-in-law is still not pregnant. According to the custom operating behind this story, that means the next brother-in-law, Shelah, needs to step up to see to it that his sister-in-law Tamar gets pregnant. But Judah intervened. The reason? Shelah was still a boy, and therefore unable to do what was required of him. So Judah then told his daughter-in-law to go back home and wait. As soon as Shelah had grown up, Judah offered, he would see to it that his son performed his duty as a brother-in-law. Tamar did as Judah suggested. She went back home to live at her father's house. But that is not the whole story. There was no question that Shelah was too young to do what was necessary. Still, Judah had other motivations. It turns out that Judah was afraid that he would lose his last and now only son. Somehow he blamed Tamar, his daughter-in-law, for the deaths of his first two sons. Yet the narrator had made it quite clear that God was behind these deaths. Had done something so bad that God thought death was the only proper punishment, and Onan had cynically refused to get Tamar pregnant, but was only too happy to get sexual pleasure from sleeping with her. God would not tolerate that hypocrisy. Judah, however, blamed only his daughter-in-law. At this juncture, can we say that we are surprised? We saw earlier that Judah's relationship with his own family was a bit sketchy. We saw the intimations that he might sit rather loosely to the truth. Most recently, he appears to have gotten rid of Tamar so that the problem he was dealing with would simply go away. Then another death in the family occurs. This time, Judah's wife dies. She is never named in the whole episode. We only know her father's name, Shua. The best we can do is call her Bath-shua, the daughter of Shua. Her only role was to bear Judah's 3 sons and name 2 of them. Then she is gone. At this point, we are faced with a startling conclusion. Judah's future, all of a sudden, is also questionable. His wife is dead. His first 2 sons are dead. No grandchildren will come from them. Shelah is left, but has to grow up still. Plus, when he does become an adult, he will have to deal with this daughter-in-law business, or this sister-in-law business, I should say. In a sense, he is in a sort of limbo. What will Judah do when he is faced with this stark future? Will he seek a remedy? Will he tend to his family? Will he keep the promise he made to Tamar, his daughter-in-law? Will he see to it that Shelah takes care of his brother-in-law responsibilities before finding a wife for his 3rd son? The answers to all these questions are disappointingly negative. Judah does nothing for his future at this point. How he squandered it will be the subject of next week's podcast, part 2 of the story of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38 of Genesis. Let me encourage you, I know you're tired of hearing this, to go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I have a way to contact you when we're ready for our mini courses. Also, if you have a question you'd like me to answer in a future Q&A section, go to my email, fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do 2 simple things. 1, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. 2, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.